Thanks for joining me on Beyond the Water Cooler. This is where we have the conversations that matter about putting the human factor back into business. Why? Because we know that when we get people right, we get business right. My guests are awesome people who know about all things leadership, engagement, mental well-being, and high performance. This is a space to listen, reflect on your own practice, and learn how to create an even better experience. I'm your host, Lisa, psychologist and psychotherapist and founder of It's Time for Change. Let's dive in. As we wrap up this season of the podcast, before I take a break for the school summer holiday, I thought I'd bring you some of my high-level thoughts about the world of work currently in terms of its people. And that's because I've been lucky enough to work with a number of clients of all sizes across all industries, and there are some common challenges. They're not surprising, but they still exist in so many organisations that I thought it's worth telling you about some of the common elements of good practice that go a long way to resolving them. Those top 5 include stress, masking in leadership, third one's around team performance, then around feedback, and finally around change. There are loads more I could have chosen, but those are 5 that come up really frequently. So let's start with stress. Yes, it's still really prevalent. And I've been asked by numerous companies to provide workshops or coaching sessions to help people cope. But the companies that have made the biggest shift towards actually making a difference and reducing stress have been those that have taken a slightly different approach. They've created space to have conversations about what is contributing to the stress, and then they've made an actionable plan to reduce it. It sounds obvious, but so many companies are still trying to address this at a surface level that focus on individual strategies. To make a real difference, you need to look at your system. It doesn't have to be complicated. I've done this in a number of ways, working with groups of people to find out what's happening for them, and then sharing this with leadership who can use that data to redesign systems and structures to improve the experience. That's why I love working with systems. All the information you need is in your organisation, but it's about extracting it and applying it in the right way to make real changes. A different way that is often great for smaller businesses, or if the issue might be about a specific person, for example, is to have one-to-one conversations with carefully worded questions that help you gather an accurate picture of needs. You can use someone in your organisation who's known to care and to listen and to respond with empathy, or using an external facilitator can create greater trust with the objectivity. The last time I did that, the value of being heard meant that a lot of people left the room saying that they felt like they'd had a coaching session as they'd aired their frustrations and were walking away with a clearer sense of what they could do differently to respond more helpfully, both for themselves and the business. The second area that comes up repeatedly is masking in leadership. I've lost count of the number of senior managers, leaders, MDs, even CEOs who share their anxiety about fulfilling their role. The pressure to succeed can be huge. We've seen recently the criticism about Rachel Reeves being tearful in the House of Commons, and that was put down to the strain she's under. Regardless of your political stance, we can all recognise the strain that she's been under. And from a human perspective, we need to acknowledge the pressure that leaders are under and to be compassionate. Admitting strain or feeling out of your depth requires a vulnerability that often only I get to see in leaders that I work with. After some coaching, those people are often able to own their own feelings, and they become role models in authenticity in the workplace, which in turn allows others to remove their masks. As soon as people can start being honest with each other about how they really feel, the narrative changes. We move from a position of being defensive into being collaborative. So, for example, I don't have these strengths, but I know you do. Recently, I got some great feedback from an MD who'd been nervous about running a leadership team session. Because he'd opened up about that, we'd been able to play with different ideas, so he felt more confident about how to show up and how to shape the day. The underlying advice was to approach the business challenges from a human perspective, moving away from sort of traditional rule books and complicated processes, and just getting back to the basics of good quality conversation about what matters most. The result was that this MD was buzzing and their team felt really positive after the session. So, how do you create the time and space to acknowledge how you feel, to be curious about why that emotion leads, and then to play with different approaches that feel right because they're aligned with who you really are? It's a time that always gets squeezed. So, putting it in your diary, but importantly, letting others know so that they can help hold you to account is ideal. Group problem solving is also a great thing to do, and I facilitate a number of groups, including Oxfordshire's business B4 People Ecosystem, where having challenges on the agenda and benefiting from peers' perspectives, as well as my own expertise and that of my session guest, makes all the difference. As one director said following our last session, being able to interact on my challenge was really beneficial. I took 3 key actions to directly address the situation I brought to the table. The benefits of talking about real world challenges can't be underestimated. If you live in Oxfordshire and would like to join me at the next ecosystem, let me know. Megan Carter of Blenheim Palace will be joining me in October as my guest to discuss authentic leadership. So, the third area, in terms of my top 5, I could easily have a top 10, but this podcast will go on forever, is team performance. And that's an area of business that's increasingly demanding my time, with organisations consciously looking at how their people function so that they are aligned and high performing teams rather than simply groups of individuals, potentially working at cross purposes, aka in competition with each other. For those of you who follow me on LinkedIn, you'll have seen a few posts recently about the types of activities that I'm encouraging people to engage with. And it'll be no surprise coming from me that they are pretty simple but get great results. A great place to start is looking at the behaviours shaping day-to-day experience and unpicking those to understand the drivers of them. Much of how we show up is unconscious, motivated by the need to protect ourselves and to succeed. And this is where going back to your values is a must. Ask your people what those values look like in practice. What does excellent look like? What does unacceptable look like? When employees are part of creating the set of expectations, it's easier to hold them to account. And better still, they hold each other to account because they share the ownership. Linking company values with our own values is a really helpful exercise too. Again, it's about authenticity. We know that when we're clear about what's important to us and we're able to communicate that, our lived experience day to day is more fulfilling. And that means we're more engaged and productive. And that also means that we're more collaborative because we've been clear about what we need from each other. For some help to explore this in more depth on your own or with your team, you can download the free High Performance Accelerator resource following the link in the show notes. It's a practical framework to drive the right behaviours for your team to perform well. Of course, focusing on team performance can take many directions. It really does depend on what specific aspect you're looking to develop. Again, those of you who know me well will know I'm anti a standard universal approach that uses one model or assessment because what is actually most helpful really does depend on your context. It's not helpful if you want to tick a box, but then I'm not that person for you. So looking at team performance, we could be looking at Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team and bringing that to life. We might use things like Likert scales to identify ways to get towards your definition of good, whatever that looks like for your team or your company. Or we might use matrices that match strengths and enjoyment with activities required of you in your role. We did that recently with a company and got phenomenal results and that they could then use, and they were so energized by it. It's often the simplest of questions and a thoughtful way of considering how to elicit meaningful responses and then how to use those for positive change that make the real difference. When done well, team performance activities should energize your people and create immediate change in the way people connect and collaborate. So the fourth area, which is integral to performance and leadership, is the need to give feedback. Yet this is another really common barrier to really good practice. People are often afraid to speak up, even those in senior positions. There's often a fear of recourse, or it feels uncomfortable for the person giving the feedback, so it's easier to stay silent. The only problem is that silence can span months or even years before issues are so entrenched and have such significant consequences that the problem is really damaging business. There are so many ways of thinking about feedback, far too many to cover in this episode of the podcast. But you can think about using frameworks such as radical candor that support people to say what needs to be said whilst also caring, or sharing positive observations with peers, or processes that recognize and reward behaviors that align with your values. There are so many layers and levels across the organization. Every workshop you engage with or meeting should generate feedback into your system that informs improvement. In other words, it should be continuous rather than an event. Think about how well developed your processes are and where there's room to grow. How does feedback happen in your organization at all levels? Leaders to managers, managers to their teams, teams back up to their managers and back up to leaders. How often are your key players across your company talking about ways to gather and utilize feedback to inform practice going forward? How well does that feedback inform your people strategy that includes L&D, reward and recognition, talent development? My experience is that the gold that comes from the space to have real conversations can really shift practice towards the ideal, but you need to make that happen beyond simply engagement surveys. The final area I'm going to mention today is change. It's a given that every organisation goes through change. In fact, organisations should be continuously changing to stay relevant, up to date in the way they think about and do things, as knowledge and tech continuously changes. Obviously, the integration of technology is becoming more relevant, but I'm particularly interested in the human side of change, especially the leadership aspect. I've worked with many leadership teams and groups of managers about how to communicate change in a way that builds confidence for people to move through the process. You might notice I use the term leadership of change rather than management, and that's deliberate. If you lead well, people will follow, and that's a whole lot easier than trying to manage people who are reluctant. Understanding why people resist change is the key to helping them move along the journey. We often interpret behaviours as just being awkward, and then difficulties arising in relationships can cause us to keep our distance. However, it's those people who we need to get closer to, reframing their challenge or negativity as potential confusion or fear or discomfort. You'll know how tricky change can feel. Just try brushing your teeth with your opposite hand to usual. Yet we often fail to acknowledge the normal human responses to change. How leaders navigate change will say a huge amount about their culture. Some advice about how to support employees starts with the question, do they feel psychologically safe to speak up? Are leaders communicating their own anxieties? Are people reassured by knowing inevitable dips in performance as new ways of working are mastered are okay? Do people have permission to try new things and make mistakes as they seek to meet new challenges? Next, think about how much information you're communicating and how. Transparency, within reason, builds trust. Joe Stevens of Oxford Innovation Space recently talked about this at the people ecosystem I was facilitating, and the power of communicating regularly, wholly, and with emotion, remembering that people are not simply assets you need to reprogram, is so critical. Identify small steps along the way so that people aren't just focusing on the goal, or else it can feel overwhelming. And then make sure to recognize and feedback as people take those steps. Acknowledge the courage and challenges of those transitions. Hear different perspectives and demonstrate the importance of those by adjusting plans if it's appropriate. To acknowledge there's not just one way, in other words, your way of getting to where you need to go. Creating your own story about the need for change and asking others to share their story of their experience provides huge insight for leaders to learn and improve the process next time. And that's one thing you can be sure of, there will be a next time. In light of where I've been working most, I've been restructuring my offer to accommodate the evident needs of leaders and their organisations. And so during the past month, when I've not been recording my podcast, I've been fine tuning what I offer, which now comes under three broad areas. The first is about human performance. And this is about helping people show up at their best with the clarity and resilience and emotional intelligence to thrive in a fast changing world of work. Think authenticity and psychological safety, understanding how to utilize the brain for better performance, how to reduce stress and emotional noise and increase emotional agility, all that kind of stuff. The second area is people leadership, where I help managers and leaders develop the awareness, emotional agility, and relational impact, along with practical skills, to lead people with confidence, purpose, and impact. And this is because strong people leadership doesn't happen by accident. This is an area where I work with organizations to create space for leaders and managers to explore, learn, and build confident, effective practice. And finally, the third area is around culture and change, helping organizations build strong, people centered cultures that stay resilient and aligned through uncertainty and change. Culture is what holds everything together, especially when things are shifting. And I support organizations to simplify that complexity, embed sustainable culture practices, and strengthen the leadership of change so that people feel included, supported, and part of where the organization's going. I'm most excited about a new service that I'm launching in September that builds on what I love most, and that's becoming an integral part of an organisation through retained partnerships. In reality, this isn't actually new. It's just that I'm packaging something I already do informally for many of my clients. It's basically support where and when it matters most. From the feedback I've had, I realise that significant value from me comes from the direct ongoing access they have, not just for delivery, but for thinking and sense making and helping clients move forward with clarity and the pace that's required of people today. And what comes to mind are emails I've had with the subject heading help from a CEO who was scratching their head over a problem impacting their business, or sitting with the head of L&D going through their people strategy and using feedback from workshops I'd facilitated to inform some potential changes, or developing a group of leaders where additional needs became apparent across the organisation and we could really quickly address those. If you're interested in finding out more about the core, strategic, or embedded partnerships, let's chat. But I'm going to wrap up today's episode by saying thank you for tuning in. I will be back in September with a slightly different format, having listened to feedback that I sought about my podcast earlier this year. Episodes will be shorter, and I'll be providing a practical, downloadable summary that highlights the key takeaways so that you don't have to take notes. There's always a lot to take in, and so having a checklist or a guide will probably help. Until then, have a great summer, and I look forward to joining you again on the other side. As I mentioned in this episode, use the link in the show notes to download the High Performance Accelerator. That's all about how you currently show up, how you need to show up, and what you need in order to be able to do that. And why not drop me an email to arrange a chat about how I can support you and your organisation? Maybe a retained partnership package is something you want to explore, or something else. But one thing you will be confident in is my love of conversations about how to do things differently. So I'm always happy to connect and chat about where things are at and where you're interested in going. My details are also in the show notes. And look out for my revamped website, which is coming soon, thank goodness, because it's going to reflect more accurately the work I now do compared to when it's originally created. As I said earlier, it's always good to evolve. So join me in September for some new content, a tweaked format, and a whole heap more value. Take care till then.